And I put cost management in really under governance because it is part of governing your cloud environment. It is obviously one of the big concerns for stakeholders when they're moving to cloud is going to be cost. And there's a number of ways you can control and have visibility of the cost of your Azure environment. If you're looking at doing a migration from on-premise into Azure, one of the critical things that you should look at, and something that we always do as part of initial discovery phase, is look at the right sizing of those resources. If you've got, a Hyper-V or a VMware environment on premise, normally you're going to or potentially you're going to overspec your Hyper-V hosts or VMware hosts. You've got plenty of CPU and memory available. You're going to give every VM a couple of vCPUs, maybe 4 gig of RAM, as a minimum. But what you really want to look at is what those virtual machines are actually using, because public cloud being pay for what you use, pay for consumption, you don't want to be over provisioning things when you move into Azure. So we generally use something like Azure Migrate or one of the third-party tools like Cloudamize or Mover to run these discovery assessments. And that will give you some estimations on what size those virtual machines should be in Azure, which means when you migrate them over, they're going to be in the right sort of ballparking or not over provisioning them. But then it's a case of ongoing monitoring of that environment to make sure, if there are other sort of cost saving opportunities on an ongoing basis. For tracking costs, that can be done via Azure Cost Management within the portal. If you're running under CSP, there's a new Microsoft customer agreement as a change to the way the billings run. So depending on whether you're on that new version or the old version, if you're on CSP, will determine whether you have access to Azure Cost Management, but that is now available for the people on the new agreement via the Azure portal. If your CSP is with Cloud Direct, we've developed our own in-house portal called Provide, and that will give you all billing information with forecasting as well via the Provide portal, so you can make use of that. There's functionality within the portal called Azure Advisor, and that will give you recommendations on a number of different categories, but one of those is cost management. So it will make recommendations, for example, if you've got a public IP address that's not attached to anything, which you're being charged for, either use it or tidy it up. It will give you recommendations on resizing virtual machines if they're hardly being used, or the performance utilization is minimal, and it will also give you other recommendations around licensing, such as reserved instances. So worth keeping an eye on that on an ongoing basis to see how you can reduce your costs. Obviously, there's also a number of other third-party tools available, which you can use as well for cost management. We touched on briefly Azure Automation, but again, you can use that for shutting down environments out of hours if you're not using them. So typically, environments like dev test, they're only going to be used, from say 8 till 8, Monday to Friday. So switch them off out of hours and at the weekends, and you will instantly reduce your Azure costs. You can make use of technology in Azure that has auto scale functionality. So things like web apps, if you're using PaaS resources, or virtual machine scale sets. Even AKS now has auto scale on the Kubernetes clusters. So this means that you can set a metric whereby it will scale out at that point to absorb the additional workload and then scale back in again afterwards. So that's really sort of making use of the platform so that it meets the demand, of your application, but only for the time that it needs it, and then scales back in again. The other way that you can see some pretty considerable cost savings is to do other than just pay as you go for things like virtual machines and SQL. So by using reserved instances, you commit to a certain resource for either 1 year or 3 years in advance, previously you had to actually pay for that up front for that 1 or 3 years, but you can now do that on a monthly basis for the same fee, and that will give you fairly significant discount on things like virtual machines. You can also make use of hybrid benefit as well if you've got existing Windows or SQL server licenses with software assurance. And by combining those two, you can actually bring costs down by up to sort of 60–70%, depending on virtual machine sizes that you're using. If you don't have Windows or SQL licenses with SA available, you can also now buy those under CSP. So we could actually purchase them on your behalf, and then you can still use hybrid benefit and still see the same sort of discount. So definitely something to consider if you've got workloads there that you know are going to be pretty well static for the next year or even 3 years, then you can really bring down the costs on those resources.